And now I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our keynote, Connie Hsu. And that's what you're here for this morning, not my ramblings. So Connie Hsu is a senior editor at Roaring Brook Press, which is an imprint of Macmillan USA, where she acquires and edits everything from picture books to young adult and nonfiction. She loves books that give readers a visceral reaction, be it goosebumps, butterflies, or a surprised laugh. And she's also always on the hunt for books that feature diversity pertaining, but not limited to, ethnic, cultural, and socioeconomic themes, and sexual orientation and identity. Prior to joining Roaring Brook, she was at Little Brown Books for Young Readers, where she worked with award-winning and best-selling authors and illustrators, including Shannon Hale, Pseudonymous Bosch, Diana Lopez, and of course, The Adventures of Beagle by Dan Santat was awarded the Caldecott Medal for the most distinguished picture book of 2014 by the American Library Association. Please welcome Connie Hsu.
Hello, good morning. Just looking at this PowerPoint, I didn't realize when blown up it would look so dire. I just thought, there's a bunny. And then I'm like, I didn't even read danger. Well, someone recently asked me what my pivotal book was. You know, that first book that ignited that initial spark of, I love reading, this is awesome. And it's not like that question of what's your favorite book, because, you know, if you're a book lover, people ask you that and you're like, God, you know, you narrow it down, please. But I know that if any of you had a moment and you just closed your eyes, you can envision that cover, or maybe the way that book felt in your hands. So I gave this some thought and considered answers that would make me sound really smart, or like a quintessential children's book author. And I wanted to say, oh, Where the Wild Things Are changed my life, or Goodnight Moon, of course. But the truth is, when I close my eyes and I visualize that life-changing book for me, I see two identical blonde girls with long hair and high ponytails, pink sweaters, and big, sweet smiles. Can you guess what it is? Sweet Valley Twins, not even High. Sweet Valley High had some arguably good moments, but no. This was the literary game changer for me. So why? Why this book? Well, for one, I love picture books now, but as a kid, I didn't have much exposure to them. I don't know if this is true for all Asian families, but my parents weren't into reading picture books to me because I should be able to read them myself. You know, they weren't even into buying them, as immigrant Chinese families often are. They couldn't justify paying more than $10 for 32 pages. It just didn't make any economic sense. And by the time I was allowed to roam free in the library, I had grown out of the picture book reading phase. I was also drawn to these books because they looked easy to read. They're slim, the type is big, it's not intimidating. And so it was perfect for a kid like me who was in the remedial reading group in school. While my dad spoke really good English at home, my family only spoke Mandarin. My mother just, my dad spoke very good English, but we only spoke Mandarin at home. My mother just never really took to English, and so even though I came to the US as a baby, I was raised with Mandarin. I was also cursed with what my family called a big tongue, because Asian parents don't mince words. So, they still say that. So certain words, both in English and in Chinese, were hard for me to pronounce. So maybe I was a remedial reader because I had an accent from speaking Chinese at home, or maybe it was my cursed big tongue. Truthfully, I have no idea. I remembered I loved reading, though. I remember understanding the words, the characters, the stories, but I also remember the way my teacher looked at me when I did my read aloud exercises. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, and I was there from the age of 3 through high school. And, you know, it's a medium-sized town for the South, and there are a fair amount of Asians, actually. There was a military base there and a NASA research center. So there was a representation of different cultures, but most were new immigrants, bringing new and strange accents with them. When my mom picked me up from school, she always hurried off because she was scared to speak with anyone. She was embarrassed about her English, and when she did have to talk, her accent covered her words like a thick blanket. I had a really kind first grade teacher who would ask my mom and me to stay after school so she could lead us through reading exercises. We did that a few times, and I know it was well intended. She had a really good heart, but all that attention just made me feel stupid. And now that I'm older, I can only imagine how that made my mom feel too. So from the very first time I met Elizabeth and Jessica Wakefield, I was hooked. And even now, off the top of my head, I remember these minute details. Elizabeth was the older one. She was the smarter, bookish one, and she had a left mole on tiny mole on her left shoulder. And later, when they got to high school, their parents gave them a red Fiat Spider to drive around. And so you see how these books do stay with you, and they'll never get out of my brain. Soon I tore through the series, and then I went on to the Babysitter's Club, and then the knockoff, the Sleepover Club. And with each book, my confidence grew, and by 4th grade, I was a reader, and I was no longer afraid to say so. But then I started to notice a few things. Whenever my friends and I role-played Babysitter's Club, for instance, I was always Claudia, the arty Japanese girl. I was neither good at art or bad at math, but I guess I could rock a sideways ponytail. And I was Asian, I guess, right? That helped. And no one else was, so there I was, 10 years old and already typecast. When I read historical fiction, I would try to imagine myself in those worlds, alongside the characters. But it was hard to believe, even in my wildest imagination, a Chinese girl showing up on Prince Edward Island to hang out with Anne of Green Gables, or knocking on Laura Ingalls Wilder's house on a prairie. It was hard to find myself in my favorite books. It wasn't until years later, when I was on the Children's Book Council Diversity Committee, that someone pointed out that this is one of the reasons why people tend to read white. And even if that reader is a person of color. To read white means that if you were to read about a character with no ethnic description or details, you automatically assume that character must be white. And I did wish I was white when I was younger. I mean, it was Alabama. I felt like all my problems would go away, nobody making Chinese eyes at me, no one making fun of my pork and chive dumplings at lunch. And so you put a part of yourself away, and then you try to assimilate. Try to disappear into the crowd, blend right in, because you can get yourself to believe it when you're not looking in a mirror and you're only looking outwards. You feel like you're a part of the world beyond you until someone points out that you don't belong. By the time I reached high school, though, I began to finally embrace who I was and where my family came from. And in college, in the middle of the cornfields of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, I ran straight for the first group of Asians I saw and ended up in an Asian sorority. I don't know how that happened. I wonder sometimes how my childhood would have been different if the first book I had read was something like The Year of the Dog. The author, Grace Lin, based the book on her childhood in upstate New York, where she was the only Asian in her classroom until a new student, Alvina Ling, joined her. Alvina and Grace ended up becoming lifelong best friends, and years later, when Alvina, who is now editor-in-chief at Little Brown Books for Young Readers, acquired and published The Year of the Dog. Grace later wrote other Chinese and Taiwanese-inspired books like The Year of the Rat, Where the Mountain Meets the Moon, which was a Newbery Honor book, and Dumpling Days. So maybe if these books had been around, no one would have made fun of my lunch. This is one reason why, and a small reason, but one, why it's so crucial to have more diversity and inclusion in children's books, in the books we produce, the authors we work with, and the people who work in the industry. These stories matter, and they make changes. When we're talking about diversity, we're not just talking about multicultural voices or writers of color. Diversity discussions touch on race, gender, geographical origin, sexual orientation, and class. And we're also talking about inclusion, which means we want those in the industry, writers, editors, everyone, to feel comfortable and safe and accepted. Just last year, for BookCon, which is an event that follows Book Expo America, it's an event for people who fan out about books, the readers to meet with authors and listen to authors on panels. So at BookCon, they had their initial headlining authors, and someone noticed that they were all white men, and wait for it, grumpy cat. And although folks in the industry have been having this diversity conversation for years, things finally came to a head, and a group of authors banded together and formed the We Need Diverse Books campaign. They immediately turned conversation into action, and in a year, they now have an award named after Walter Dean Myers, one of the most celebrated children's books authors like ever, and he's African American, recently passed away, so this is something to make sure his legacy lives on. There's a classroom initiative, an internship program, and they're busy pulling together the first ever Diversity Books Festival in 2016 in Washington, D.C. If you're not familiar with We Need Diverse Books, I urge you to support this grassroots campaign and visit their website. They have extremely useful resources, and they highlight books by authors of color and stories that touch on diverse themes. Now, the organizers of BookCon immediately responded to the social media uproar about their white male headliners and quickly organized a panel for the We Need Diverse Books team. The panel was held in a small room in the basement of the Javits Center in New York. It was supposed to hold about 150 people, but the crowd was out the door. The organizers also revisited their author lineup to include more authors of color. And you know, one wonders, wasn't it obvious to them that this was a problem? Well, it's tough, because people, when they don't have diversity on the forefront of their minds, they tend to default to what they know. And it's not intentional, but the actions always have a greater effect than intention, right? As a side note, I thought it was sort of funny that even after the BookCon folks addressed the controversy, they just couldn't get a break. When they shared their new lineup, they still got it wrong. If you look closely, this is supposed to be Ayesha Saeed, a Pakistani-American author, but the photo is John Green. Keep laughing. It makes me laugh every time. Let's go back and look at it again. There you go. In June 2013, multicultural publisher Lee & Low Books put together a graphic illustrating that although 37% of the population of the United States are people of color, only 10% of children's books published contained multicultural content. This gap has remained steady for 18 years. The Cooperative Children's Book Center, also known as CCBC, put together a study called Children's Books by and About People of Color published in the United States. In 2013, out of an estimated 3,200 books they reviewed, only 7% were by authors of color and 8% were about people of color. 2014 was only a slight improvement. The number of books by people of color rose a mighty 1%. Books about people of color went up 3%. So why is publisher response so slow? Well, for one, for those who've been published, you know that the process takes time. Publishers can start spreading the word about wanting more books by diverse authors or about diverse material, but first we have to wait for them to be written. And then we wait to get them from agents. Then we have to go through the acquisitions process, the editing process, put them into production, and a year later, after that, you have a book. It's like taking a slow walk with dinosaurs. Another reason is that it's just not that simple. It's not just about making people aware. It's about starting early, digging deeper, uncovering some of the social or economic obstacles, because if we don't identify those walls, we're doomed to keep running into them. I only know my own path, so I'll use that as an example. My father is an engineer. He was top of his class in Taiwan, and he came to the US in the 1960s with just enough money for a bag of chocolate and a train ticket. He landed in San Francisco and took the train halfway across the Midwest and landed right here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where he enrolled in a master's program at the University of Minnesota. Go Gophers. He worked night shifts at the Pillsbury Mill, and with almost no sleep, he went to class every day. He went on to a PhD program at Purdue, and he basically never went back to Taiwan to visit his family until both his parents fell ill. He returned for one visit, but before he was able to go back again, both died. A few years later, his older brother followed, and so my dad was in America alone with no family, and this is what he sacrificed in order to build a life for my brother and me. So even though I loved reading, loved English, and wanted to be a writer or work in something literary, I didn't know how to tell my dad that my dream is to live poorly but passionately. It's ingrained in Chinese culture for the child to support the parent someday. It's tradition to send your first paycheck to your parents as a sign of gratitude for all they've done in raising you. I can do none of those things. And even so, the very fact that I'm in publishing, I'm an editor, and that I'm here proves that I'm actually really, really privileged. Deep in my heart, I wanted to be an English major, but that's not a career. So I graduated with a bachelor's in advertising, and then I had a say anything moment. Do you all know that movie? For those who haven't seen it, there's a scene where John Cusack says he doesn't want to sell anything, buy anything, or process anything as a career. And so I went back to school for a master's in journalism. After college, I interned at a couple of regional magazines and then made the big trip to New York City, where I landed my first job at Starbucks. That allowed me to take on an internship and later a freelance gig at In Touch Weekly, a gossip magazine, which led to a job at a startup magazine by TV Guide. And then that folded, and I was jobless with a brand new apartment lease. To make ends meet, I took on odd jobs, one of which was as a first-grade substitute daycare instructor. And there, I found my true calling through story time. I read picture books, chapter books. I helped the children with their reading. I came across this book called Verla Kay's The Orphan Train, which blew my mind. Kids were asking, like, Miss Connie, what does quarantine mean? And they're like 5. And a friend of mine who was at Scholastic at the time heard about how much I loved those books and forwarded a job posting at Little Brown to me. At my interview, I remember seeing The Year of the Dog on a shelf in the lobby. I remember picking it up and thinking, wow, I sure wish I had a book like this. And then I went into the offices and met Alvina, and I found out she edited that book. And seeing her behind her desk of organized chaos and papers, I finally had my mirror, and I knew where I wanted to be. So how lucky was I to have parents believe in me, allow me to wander and search for a career that paid little but made me so happy. So that is privilege. I can only imagine how hard it is if you don't have that financial fallback. Even if you don't accept your parents' help, just knowing that they're there can give you a lot of confidence, can make you fearless. Because $30,000 a year or less in one of the most expensive cities in the entire world is damn near impossible. And so this is one of the major, major reasons why we are not seeing as many people get into the publishing process. So here I am talking about how hard it is to be in a low-paying, steady job. And then I look out on you all, and I'm like, well, you're writers. My God, how do you eat? I know how much I pay for books. My guess is you do it by working really, really, really hard. And I think you all deserve major high fives for doing this. I do not envy the life of a creator. One of my authors, while I was at Little Brown, is a guy named Dan Santat, who wrote and illustrated The Adventures of Beagle, the Unimaginary Friend. Before this book, though, Dan had done the impossible. He turned down a job at Google, of all things, as a Google Doodler, because he wanted to pursue picture books wholeheartedly. Dan is Thai. You don't do that. You don't turn down a job at Google. So the last 5 years, he's become an insane work machine. In 1 year, in 2014, he had, I think, 14 picture books come out. Talk about Asian guilt. And this year, at last, the hard work did, thank goodness, pay off. And he got that magical call from the Caldecott Committee. Validation, a medal, pop the champagne, you've done it. The height of picture book achievement. And when Dan called his parents to tell him what he'd won, his dad said, okay, I'll tell your mother when she wakes up. Click. When I called my dad, he was proud. He said, oh, I'm so happy for you. How much is the reward money? There's no reward money. So something as simple as culture or parental pride can serve as obstacles. But you know, the same goes for any writer of any background, right? You should all be thinking of including diversity in your writing. I know that this is controversial, the idea of someone writing outside of their own perspective. But why can't we try? Why can't we encourage people to step outside of their own experiences, research the hell out of a culture, and just try? Because if we start to dictate who can write what, then it's equal to literary segregation. You've got to do it right, though, and you've got to do it thoughtfully. One way is to read and read and read, like books by Patricia McCormick or Elliot Schrieffer, or A.S. King's Ask the Passengers. All these writers looked beyond their own experiences and authentically brought their characters to life. There's a wealth of information online, from the Diversity 101 posts on the CBC Diversity website to Melinda Lowe's Diversity and YA blog. Read, learn, write, and do it over and over and over again. We're making small steps. This year, the awards circuit saw a huge wave of diverse content and people of color. The tide is coming, and hopefully all of this will give young readers a chance to see mirrors everywhere, be it on a cover, at the writing table, or behind a messy desk at a publishing house. And one last shameless plug. I left Little Brown a year ago, and my new list at Roaring Brook Press is about to launch this summer. Here are some diverse books that I am enormously proud of, and I hope that they get to those important young readers someday. Thank you. And I think that there's is there time or some time for a Q? Plenty of time? All right, great. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
I have a very simple question. Who did the illustration on the Margaret Mackey cover?
That is Eleanor Davis. Yay! In the comics world, you know, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, women are still emerging in graphic novels and comics. In fact, I was talking to Mariko just a couple days ago, and she said, you know, I always love it when I go to a dinner and I'm talking to a group of old, grizzled comics veteran men, and then they turn to me and they're like, hey, little girl, let me tell you something about comics. And Mariko's won like 1,000 awards. Yes?
Would it be appropriate if I'm submitting a picture book and I'm just submitting the text, would it be appropriate, like in the cover letter, to say this would be ideal to be illustrated as an African-American family, or whatever? I mean, is it? Or not?
It's funny. It's funny because editors are all different animals, and some are nice animals and some are not nice animals. Don't quote me on that. Why did I just say that? I like it. I don't like copious art notes where it's like, and then she moves 2 feet and drops her red hat to her side. You know, I don't, but I do like to get a sense of the author's vision, because as an author, that's your book, it's your creation, it's your idea, it's something that you came from the heart, and so I do want to honor that. And I think that it's also good to let editors know that you want to have, you know, a diverse or a multicultural character in your book. I think also researching illustrators too, and saying, you know, I find that this book could be comparable to the following books will give editors an idea of what you hope the final product will be. Yes?
What kind of Native American authors or subjects have you worked with?
I'm currently working with this nonfiction author named Steve Shankin, and or Shankin. I should learn to pronounce his name. But he's working on a book called Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indians, and it's about the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. It was during a time when they tried to assimilate native cultures into the Anglo-white world, and the effects of that, and also how in that school football became almost in a Friday Night Light style, the way that the students could feel like they owned something and achieved something. But Native, I'm glad you brought that up, because Native books are really, there's just a dearth of them. And for several reasons. I think one is, again, getting the material, telling people we're looking for those stories across the board. Another reason why is there's been some criticism, major criticism of late from people who are of Native backgrounds, who feel that for years a lot of white authors would take on their stories and misrepresent them. And so first you have more people writing about it, but incorrectly, and then you have the criticism, and now now people who aren't Native are afraid to write, and so we're sort of at this impasse. And I think that the one answer is to get more Native writers, and then the other answer is to try to be fearless if you truly are passionate about a story featuring Native American characters or storylines. Yes?
Actually, a comment. I was the AWP, the Leading Diverse Books Native presentation. And just so everybody knows, they are getting recognized now by like the KKK and the Nazis. They're getting like feedback and emails and things like that. And the people who represented them, they said they were so excited because that means that they're getting out there.
It's true. I'm glad they heard about it. Yeah. In the back?
How do you as an editor make sure that when you're editing a book that is outside of your own experience, whether it's gender or race or time or whatever, that the story is authentic?
That is one of the biggest conundrums, because who are we to say we're experts on anything, really? I guess I could say I'm pretty good at if a word sounds nice or a line sounds nice, right? But beyond that, one thing to do, some people have done, is reach out to librarians who are so well connected and so well read, wider read than editors, I'd say. And librarians are key resources in putting you in touch with people who are of that experience and can provide their perspective on it. It's tough though, because I have an African American editor colleague, good friend of mine named Stacy Barney, and she gets really frustrated sometimes because she feels like that can result in an editor becoming lazy, where they feel like all they have to do is run it by one person, and then it's fine. And so she likes to say, "I'm not your black checker. That is not my job." And so when she said that, it sort of, to me, I felt like, okay, see, you can't just pass it off to any one person and say, you've read it, you're of that culture, it gets the gold stamp. You have to try a little harder, and that's why I think librarians are the way to go, because they'll tell you if they don't like something. Oh, yes?
Can you tell us, I'm really intrigued by the Marta, Big and Small, because I like Generina and I love elephants. And also, a couple of things that I was thinking about. One is, I'm curious, I love the fact that, like, with stories with diverse characters, that's not their story, and this seems to be such an example. And I was curious, when Jen sent the manuscript, if she doesn't identify in the text anything about the characters, composition or whatever, if that was a decision you made when you assigned an illustrator, or if you had a discussion with her, or when the manuscript she sent to you actually said, I want this. I mean, I haven't read the book, so I don't know it, but I just thought that would be a good example of that kind of process.
Well, I love working with Jen. This is my second book with her. She is a master at incorporating simple Spanish into the text. And so the way this one reads is, you know, Marta is una niña, an ordinary girl, to el insecto, Marta is grande, big, very big. And it sort of goes through her comparing herself to several animals. And then there's a twist where to a snake, Marta is sabrosa, tasty, very tasty. And then there's a page when you just see the snake in Marta's shoe, and it's like, Marta, ¿dónde está? Where are you? And it turns out that Marta is I can't even pronounce it, ingeniosa. See, this is what happens. You can talk about someone who's not an expert at something. A clever, very clever girl. So I think just by the fact that there was Spanish in the text, we immediately wanted to have a Latina main character. Yes?
Does the subject of religion and faith come up much in the talking about diverse books? Because it seems like there's a real lack in children's writing, especially in a positive context. Yeah. Is that something that broached?
You know, it's funny about highlighting religion, because I think, you know, there are many kinds of religions too, and so I think from a sales perspective, they worry that if they highlight it too much, it becomes a niche book. There are books that I love that feature characters of faith. One is Rapture Practice by Aaron Hartzler. It's about him growing up in a fundamentalist Christian family. And while it shows his struggle, it's a memoir of growing up in that environment, he has a lot of love for his family and his faith. There's also Sort of Like a Rock Star by Matthew Quick, and the main character is a essentially homeless girl who has a lot of positivity and optimism that she shares with the world around her. And she's Catholic in the book, and she relies on her faith to help her get through hard times. So religion and authenticity of characters who have strong faith are definitely something that goes with like telling a great story and creating a real character. But as something that is highlighted, I think that it can be a little tougher. Although I've seen books where they've highlighted, Muslim characters or Jewish characters, and so I feel like just write the story and let it shine, and then figure out how to sell it.
How about gender? Like, there's like 10 dudes in here, so do you? I don't know. It just seems like our boys, like they don't have like role model guys at heart very often, and we kind of push them into sports and whatnot. So how about diversity as far as like to gender?
Yeah, well, children's books does draw a lot of women within the publishing walls as well, publisher walls, and so. But it's a tough conversation because there are more women writing, I think, in general, but overall it's mostly the men that get celebrated. And so there are role models in terms of Rick Riordan, Lemony Snicket, John Green, Andrew Smith, and these are people that you've heard about because they get a lot of attention. And so I feel like we would love to see more men in publishing, writing, and working at the publisher, but I also feel like when we celebrate the writers, we need to be, as a whole, looking at a better balance of female versus male too. But though you're right, that's something that comes up a lot where we wonder if we're losing boy readers because the material tends to be skewed female, right? Because we're all, I'm female and that's all I know. but I think that that's more part of the conversation, active conversation among editors than diversity was at a certain point. We all said, oh, we need more boy books. We need more boy books. We actually do say that. And I remember one time, it kind of made me slightly uncomfortable, but I was working at a company and they hired a male editor, and you know, around the table, everyone said, we have a boy, yay! And I was glad for that. At the same time, I thought, well, no, you don't walk into a law firm of 99% men and they're like, we have a woman, you know. So, but that's an interesting point you bring up too. That's a tougher conversation because it is an imbalance. I don't have an answer. Yes, Wanda.
I sense that there are more illustrators tend to be male. And is that true with the statistics you know?
Again, it's one of those things where is it more males illustrating or if it's more males being celebrated? And so there are theories about that, about why, and I think, you know, some include, like librarians are mostly women, and if you're a good-looking guy, I'm kidding. Don't quote me on that. I don't know. But yeah, I do feel like if you look at the Caldecott winners of years past, you will see that there are a lot of male illustrators, including my own, you know, author, being celebrated, and so, but there are a lot of amazing female illustrators as well, and I think more and more are coming. So I think it's sort of like the same way diverse content is changing, and I think that the tide is also coming for women to be celebrated in that field. Oh, yes, follow up.
This is on a different subject. You mentioned earlier something about a concern that something might become a niche book. Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about that. Can't that be a positive thing, something being a niche book?
Yes, it can be a positive thing if that audience, I mean, it's a numbers game. So if that audience proves to be a book buying audience, then it is a positive. I think, for example, I have been seeing that books about Asian Americans or by Asian Americans are quickly growing, and they do have a good audience. They do have a buyer. So having Asian themes is a definite positive. Having African American characters or themes, a definite positive. But when we say niche, we mean like an even smaller group than that, or that group hasn't demonstrated, or we don't have data on them actively buying books. And I know that people get tired of the statement, well, it's a business, you know, because it's a business, but it's a business for children, you know, and there is a responsibility there. But I feel like at the end of the day, you do your best to push outside of the boundaries of sales and marketing and publicity and those challenges and hope for the best. So that's where we are. In the back.
So this is my question. So as far as from the publisher's perspective, how do you sort of counter that narrative of, well, those books don't sell, right? So and the narrative of low expectations, which then like leads to all kinds of other decisions like artwork on the front and design and marketing plans or whatever. So I think that that's been one of the problems with diverse books in the past of this sort of low expectations becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy because of decisions made, business decisions. So what kinds of changes are you seeing or that you're hoping to see?
You know, I think that, and that is an excellent question, and I think it starts with people being aware and thinking outside of the normal ways we do business. For instance, one example is it is really hard to find good comparable data on sales for books on certain diverse books. For instance, when I was trying to acquire Marta, I was looking for books that had, light Spanish in it, and the sales are terrible. And I thought, how do I go in there with my P&L and justify this book? So I called up a few agents who represent Latino authors, and I said, can you help me? I want to buy this book. I want to make this book. I do not have sales. Can you point me to books that you know have had really good or decent sales? And if you represent that author, can you ask that author for permission for me to know what their sales numbers are? Because the one tool that every publisher uses is BookScan. And BookScan only reports a certain number of booksellers. And a lot of these books are sold through clubs, are sold through special markets. There are channels that don't report through BookScan. So there's an inherent flaw in that very way we do business. So that's how I've started doing it, by asking people for proprietary information. But the authors were game. Once they are okay with sharing that, then it became okay for me to take that and justify why I wanted to buy the book. Another publicity is a major component of getting a book recognized. So I used to work with this publicist named Faye B, and she's now at Simon & Schuster. Faye is amazing. She is all about promoting diverse books. And when Faye worked with one of my authors, Diana Lopez, she got her in newspapers, regional newspapers, magazines. She got her all over the place. Diana's list of media hits went from 5 to like 15 because she cared. And so I think that we start with the conversation and then we encourage thinking beyond what we do, because if we keep doing the same thing, we're going to keep ending up at the same place. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about your list, how big your list is, and if there's anything that you feel like you're not seeing that you'd really like to see?
Yeah, my list, everything from picture books, nonfiction, YA, graphic novels. I'm doing about 12 to 15 books per year. I've been busy. In 2016, I have so far 11. And I've pretty much gotten quite a few dream projects. I have picture books with authors of color, an illustrated YA. Saving Montgomery Still is about a girl growing up in a small town with 2 lesbian moms and sort of dealing with a town full of people who don't understand what her family is like. And coming up, I also have 2 graphic novel memoirs and some middle grade series as well. What I'm looking for is really fun chapter books. Featuring diverse and multicultural characters. I would love A Year of the Dog. It already exists, I know this. But I want it. So, yes?
Straight writers writing more queer characters, but I sometimes worry that publishers will buy a lot of those books and then feel that they've kind of filled the need and readers will never have actually heard from the lesbian authors. Like, is there any way to prevent that happening? Is there any, or what do publishers do to encourage people from the community?
Yeah, it's hard because when we get submissions, do you point at, there's a question of whether or not you point out whether the writer is, a queer author, right? And I think that it's like, well, should the work stand on its own, or should it be heard from a voice that comes from authenticity? I have to say, I haven't seen as many books that are written by straight authors of late out on submission. I think generally what I've seen are people who are very open about their backgrounds and who they are. And that's actually a key selling point, because if I'm going to be sending my author out on the circuit, I want them to be able to tell their story. And I think that's important. Mariko is a queer author, and she's fantastic. And so is Melinda Lowe. Ash, read that. It's great. Ash is about it's a retelling of Cinderella, and it's set in a fantasy world where there are no of these like social limitations that we have in our society, and women can love women, men can love men, and it's a beautiful love story about the Cinderella who falls in love with not the prince, but the prince's main huntress. So, but yeah, for me, personally, I would prefer an author who is writing from, their experience. Yes?
That brings up something that has struck me since you began to say, go outside your comfort zone, write about others. Is it possible to really get an authentic voice of someone who is totally out of your culture, your background, and so forth? I mean, I would think that people who have experienced something are going to write with much more authenticity. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Sherman Alexie. He really sounds Indian, or Native American.
Well, we better. If we can't put ourselves in everybody else's shoes, we're in trouble.
Yeah,
what he said, yeah.
In other people's shoes, but I wonder how, do you really have all the sense of their experience, the little verbal tics that are part of their culture?
I feel that when we talk about including diverse content in books, it's not saying that you're always writing a first-person perspective from a very specific character. It's about making sure your story represents the world around you. And if that includes having, secondary multicultural characters that you write well, and that you write with as much passion and care that you write the main character in, then try. The idea is just not to always default to the same thing over and over again. And so I feel like, for instance, books by E.L. Konigsberg, in A View from Saturday, she has an Indian character, and she writes him beautifully. As I mentioned before, A.S. King's Ask a Passenger. Amy King is straight, but she wrote a beautiful story about a girl sort of discovering her sexuality. And I think you do so by reading a lot, caring a lot, and trying. If it doesn't, we're not saying, you have to write in diverse characters, because that would feel forced and that would be wrong. But to think about it, even considering it at the outset, is that major change that could, flow through the rest of your story.
Right after this in a panel called Whose Stories Get Told by Whom? So you might want to.
If this is covering the same territory, feel free to just skip on. But one of the things that I've been watching is we see this kind of groundswell of support for diverse voices, and I think editors we keep hearing that they're very supportive of this, and that's wonderful. But sometimes what some of us are finding in the trenches is that we're getting back messages like, we want this story to be more universal, or that's a comment I've gotten with a queer character, and it kind of gives me pause, because I wonder if it's pushing us back into that sales question of, I know that there are editors that are passionate, like you, and editors care about the books they're making, but how is that conversation taking place behind closed doors, where you're trying to negotiate between, the sales folks and the art that you want to put out in the world, and when you are making a book that traditionally has been seen as more of a niche story, because people think, well, if it doesn't represent the majority of people, that story isn't for the majority population, it's only for the diverse children, which we know is not true, but how is that conversation, how do you see that playing out in publishing?
One way that I've seen it change is, because you're right, editors are passionate. We're preaching, to the choir here, and it's really sales and marketing and publicity, where after your lovely little book goes into their hands, the fate rests with them. And I think a personal touch goes a long way. I was just listening to, I think it's on This American Life, about how there was this group in California, and they wanted to vote against Prop 8 and get people to, when it came up again, to change their vote. And it was people who were gay themselves, making personal connections with voters, and 9 times out of 10, the voters would change their minds. And I feel like that's probably something that we could be doing in publishing, and so that it's not just a piece of paper with a story on it, it's a person behind it. And so I think authors who write really engaging author letters with their submissions, authors who send in videos, who show that, who show the person behind the book, can go a really long way. And we started to do that to some extent. But the main problem is that you don't want to be seen as a number, right? So you've got to do everything you can to avoid that. Okay.
Where are you at rank with early readers? Are you publishing them, or is it picture books, or
Early readers are a really funny format and really difficult. The reason is they're generally 4-color books, but around 48 pages, but they sell for $3.99. And that's the production cost on one early reader is actually not that much lower than a picture book. And so a picture book you can charge $17.99 for, and so you see that big price gap. So the only way you can make money on early readers is to have critical mass and sell, you know, like tens of thousands of copies, and you have to be able to guarantee that. And so publishers that do it well include DK and HarperCollins. They tend to have a line built from years past. They also do licensed early readers where they work with like movie tie-ins, like Despicable Me or you know, Mattel. And so that's one way that early readers are viable. But original early readers are really, really difficult for those very reasons. You have to sort of guarantee a sales projection of fairly high numbers, make the costs work with that low price point, and the biggest way to ensure that your early reader does well is getting into mass stores like Walmart and Target and Costco and Sam's Club. And they're very selective because they have limited shelf space. So I would say most publishers don't do leveled readers for those very reasons. And I've worked at 2 houses, and those are the same reasons that we discussed. And so, but chapter books, early chapter books like Clementine or Mercy Watson are definitely something that I'm looking for, and I know other houses are looking for that too. You're welcome.